In this section of the lecture, I'm going to give a little bit of background about China and the Soviet Union and talk a little bit about their economies prior to the time at which they adopted, or the times at which they adopted, communist command-based method of organising economic activity. I'll start off with China by saying something about China's geography. So obviously China is an extremely large landmass, about similar size to the United States, and also sharing similar latitudes and climate as the United States. Being such a large country, there's huge regional diversity in China. So you have, for example, a northeastern Manchurian region, which is rich in natural resources. You've got the northern region, which includes the large city areas of Beijing and Tianjin, but where you also have extensive rural areas. You've got the lower Yangtze macro region, which has Shanghai, and also highly productive rural agricultural areas. So China is a country where there's a relatively small proportion of the landmass that's suitable for agricultural activity, although of course being such a large country, that still allows a large, compared to many other countries, absolute amount of land for agricultural activity. It's relatively arid. It has three main river systems. I guess the western terms for those would be the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, and the Pearl River, and a lot of agricultural and economic activity has concentrated around those regions. So we've talked about China earlier on, in particular in the context of thinking about the Industrial Revolution and why it happened in Britain and not in China. So I've made the point before that from a period from around about 10th century to 17th, perhaps as late as 17th or 18th century, perhaps a little bit earlier, China has to be considered an advanced economy. It had an agricultural sector that was, by international standards, relatively productive, partly due to soil quality, partly due to the technologies that had been developed for farming. China also had a limited industrial sector. It was relatively advanced in its commercial and legal processes, in having monetization, in having a monetary system, and also had relatively developed transport and market systems. But that state of being a relatively advanced economy finishes, as we talked about before, around about 16th, 17th, 18th century. And so from the start of the 19th century, from the type of reasons we talked about, China experiences slow growth and external encroachment. And so from 1820 to 1913, in fact, China's GDP per capita drops from being 90% of the world average to 40% of the world's average. So there's a significant worsening of China's economic position relative to the economic development that's happening in the rest of the world at that time. And so that lack of economic success, the infusion of new ideas that start to come, for example, from the treaty ports in China, the loss of war against the Japanese creates increasing social, political concern about China's economic status. And so eventually the imperial government is overthrown. It starts off in Wuhan, a revolt in Wuhan that gradually that then leads to a snowballing other provinces seceding from the empire. This introduces essentially 40 years of war in China. So from 1911 to 1927, there's the major civil war. From 1927 to 37, the nationalist government is in place. Some more stability during that period and higher rates of economic growth than had been achieved during the preceding Civil War period or periods before that. But then again, the interruption of the war with Japan beginning in 1937, continuing through to the end of World War II in 1945, and then the civil war between the nationalist government and the Communist Party from 1945 to 1949. So a significant period of political and economic disruption and turmoil before we move to the period of communist government, which starts from 1949 onwards. The Soviet Union, also notable obviously for being a huge country in terms of its landmass. The Soviet Union occupied 1/6 of the world's landmass. Its borders were 20,000 kilometres, and it had 12 different countries as neighbours around those borders. Highly diverse in its geography, going from tundra to forest to steppe to arid to mountainous regions. Exceptionally cold climate. Soviet Union, a region country that is exceptionally rich in resources. So it's one of the world's major producers of oil. Iron ore today is known to, for example, have the world's largest reserves of natural gas and many other minerals and commodities. So a relatively rich country in terms of its resource base. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the Soviet Union, like China, is economically a relatively backward country. It's primarily an agricultural economy taking place in rural regions, and for much of the period up to mid to late 19th century agriculture is organised in a feudal system. There's high rates of population growth which keep down rates of growth in GDP per capita. It's known that there are resources of products like coal, for example, but those resources are distant from where the population centres are. So Russia being such a big landmass, the population isn't spread evenly over it. 75% of the population are concentrated in 25% western portion, whereas resources distributed at some distance from that. So there were resources, but without adequate transport systems, difficult to access those resources. And in the period late 19th, early 20th century, there's some early industrial development. For example, the government invests in railway systems to try and link up with those resources to promote industrial development. Serfs are emancipated in early 1860s. There's the Stolypin reforms, which try to reform agricultural activity and introduce land ownership or land tenure for peasants to try and improve incentives for agricultural production. And so that's reflected in, for example, some improvements in standard of living and economic development. Major political disruption. There's World War I that Russia is involved in, following which there's the revolutions in 1917, the February Revolution, and then the provisional government being overthrown by the Bolsheviks takeover in October 1917. That initiates a civil war, which then lasts from 1918 to 21, when the war is resolved in favour of the Bolsheviks and communist government is set up on more established terms in the Soviet Union. So that's a little bit of background about both the Soviet Union and China coming to communism. When China and the Soviet Union come to communism, what goes with that is a communist or command-based method of organising economic activity. The big initial objective of both countries is a phenomenon known as big push industrialisation. So big push industrialisation is the idea that you're really going to force or direct economic activity increasingly towards industry and away from agriculture. And there are really two motivations for that. One is that it's increasingly being realised that the basis of military or national security is industrialisation. That industrialisation promotes military power, which provides national security. So both China and the Soviet Union want to industrialise because at the times they shift to communism, because they think that will provide greater national security. There's also the other motivation that, of course, they've observed the experience of countries in Europe and other countries that have developed via industrialisation. That industrialisation is a method by which you can increase the living standards of your population. So when China and the Soviet Union get their communist governments, the initial objective in economic terms of both these governments is this idea of big push industrialisation, that you are going to try to industrialise your economy for military reasons and for reasons of promoting the well-being of your population. The big push part is the idea that you are really, through government intervention, going to try and force the pace at which that industrialisation occurs. That you are going to, as a government, actively intervene to try and direct economic activity towards industrialisation at a faster rate than might otherwise have occurred. And so it needs to be recognised, industrialisation in a different way than the cases we've talked about previously. So it's certainly not the case that there was no government in creating the movement towards industrialisation in Japan or in the later industrialisers that we talked about, such as Germany and France. Government plays a role there. But the difference really here is the degree to which the government allows industrialisation to occur at its own pace versus tries to force the pace of industrialisation. The big thing about China and the Soviet Union is the deliberate attempt to push the pace of industrialisation more rapidly than would otherwise have occurred, for government to play a bigger role in forcing the pace compared to the other cases of industrialisation that we've talked about. And they do that through this method of having a command-based approach to organising economic activity. And that involves several features. It involves the government increasingly taking ownership of economic resources. In both the Soviet Union and China, initially nationalise, or government takes over industrial resources. Initially they both retain private ownership of agricultural property. In the Soviet Union that happens under the new economic plan. In China under the first 5-year plan, private sector, there's private ownership in the agricultural sector, but progressively both China and the Soviet Union also nationalise or collectivise agricultural resources. So they take over ownership of agricultural land. So there's government ownership of economic resources. The other big feature of command-based economy is that the government directs economic activity. And the government says what should be produced in the economy. And they do that via output targets and control of resource allocation. So, for example, a theme we'll come back to in the next section of the lecture, if you want to industrialise, it means you need to get capital equipment. You need to buy that capital equipment. How are you going to buy the capital equipment? Well, you have to pay for it out of the resources you're producing in your economy at the moment. These are both primarily agricultural economies, so what they need to do is they need to create a surplus of agricultural output that they can use to pay for buying capital equipment, and the way they do that is through this control of resource allocation. So what they say is to rural producers, look, you have to provide us, the state, with this much of what grain, for example, you produce. And we will then use that to purchase the capital equipment that we need to kickstart industrialisation. So they're able to direct, for example, agricultural producers to give them some of their production, which they can then use to promote industrialisation. So the government, at a high level, it's determining what should be produced, and there the big idea is that we should be producing more industrial output, in particular in the initial stages, heavy industry, goods like steel should be being produced, iron and steel should be being produced, but also that you need to have the scope to make that happen, and so that involves control of resource allocation in the way that I've just described. This is a really exceptionally stylised sort of example of the way control of resource allocation might happen, that essentially if you were a producer of wool or wheat or milk, you would be given a target for what you had to produce, and you would also be told how much of various inputs you were going to be allowed to have. So to produce a bushel of wheat, you might be told that you were going to be given, say, 10 hours of worker labour, 1/10 of a tractor, or 1/10 of sort of time of a tractor, and a particular amount of land. So this is, I'm not saying this is exactly how an exact example of how planning worked in China or the Soviet Union, but what I'm saying is that this general idea of input-output is the way that planning takes place, that in the first instance the government decides on the targets that it has for output, and in the second instance it seeks to implement those targets by directing resource allocation, by saying how much producers of particular goods will get out of the economy's resources to enable them to actually achieve producing that output. In both these countries, the command economy, as I've talked about a bit already, involves directing investment to heavy industry and machinery. That's the idea of big push industrialisation. To get the resources to underpin the investment that's necessary for that industrialisation to occur, collectivisation of agriculture occurs. So that's where the state is taking ownership of agricultural land and directing production in the agricultural sector. Both countries put a high degree of emphasis on education as a source of future economic development, and so significantly invest in mass education. They largely close themselves off to the rest of the world. So there's relationship between Soviet Union and China. For example, after China becomes communist in 1949, but Soviet Union and China are largely closed off apart from that to the rest of the world. Soviet Union, there's the Eastern Bloc countries that it has contact with. China, it's really primarily the Soviet Union. So compared with other countries that were opening up to international trade in the aftermath of World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement and the GATT, this isn't happening in these two regions. As I've talked about, again, both the Soviet Union and China come to a model of thoroughgoing command economy, for example, 5-year plans, after initially adopting a more limited approach. Then it has to be said, if we're sort of looking across the whole of the period of these economies as planned economies, there are then periods when some aspects of full planning are undone. So we have a transition from partial command economy, if you like. So in both countries there's a phase where initially the agricultural sector is still a private sector. Then that sector is nationalised so that you have a very thoroughgoing command economy in terms of nationalisation of economic resources, in terms of control of production activity. But then once some of the failings of that system of thoroughgoing command planning become evident, you have reforms taking place to the approach to planning and the command economy. We'll talk about that in more detail in the final section of this lecture for the Soviet Union. And in the case of China, for example, after the Great Leap Forward and the famine, which I'll talk about in the next section of the lecture, there's an undoing of some aspects of the command economy, such as the communes in the rural areas, and also a recognition that procurement policies, the amount of grain you take from rural areas to finance investment, the pace at which you can promote investment has to be balanced against feeding the population. It would be wrong to characterise these two command economies as complete economic failures. It wasn't, for example, the case that GDP per capita went backwards after the introduction of communist command-based methods of organising economic activity. In fact, as we saw in the introductory section of this lecture, there was positive economic growth, which increased to different degrees GDP per capita in both the Soviet Union and China after the introduction of communist government. And so in the final part of this section of the lecture, I want to recognise that period of economic growth associated with the command economy in both these countries. The basic theme in talking about this success of the command economy is that essentially you had a system in both countries that was to some degree suited for directing resources to industrial activity, in particular heavy industry. So in China, between 1952 and 1978, the communist system is successful in sustaining relatively high levels of investment. 30% of GDP is a high level of investment, and strong growth in industrial output. So industrial output grows by 11.5%. You have to remember, that's not saying that productivity in the whole economy was growing by 11.5%. It's not saying productivity in industry is growing by 11.5%. What it's saying is that the Chinese economy was shifting what it was producing from the agricultural sector to the industry sector, and that meant that the amount of industrial output in China was growing strongly during this period. But it comes back to the initial point on this slide, that a growth rate of 12% for 25 years shows that this was a system that was relatively successful in directing resources to industrial activity, and the share of industry in output increases from 18 to 44% in the period before the introduction of economic reform in 1978. In the Soviet Union, similarly, the communist system is able to achieve high levels of investment. So 8% of GDP in 1928 to 38% in 1950. And industrial production, similar to China, increases strongly when you've got government directing resources towards industry. Now, again, as we talked about in previous lectures, the productivity of a worker in industry is different to the productivity of a worker in agriculture. The general idea is that a worker is more productive in agriculture than industry. So if China and the Soviet Union are being successful in shifting workers from agriculture to industry, then because of the command economy, then it really follows that they're also going to have been successful in generating some economic growth through that structural change that they've created. And in fact, that was the case. We see that in China, GDP per capita doubled between 1950 and 1978. And we see that in the Soviet Union, if we just focus on the initial period of the full command economy from 1928 to 1937, before the Soviet Union starts to get involved extensively in wartime activity. Then we also see quite impressive economic growth. GDP per capita growing from $1,370 to $2,156. This is the graph that I've shown in the first section, but just to repeat for you. So we've got communist government coming in, and we've got fairly rapid rates of growth in GDP per capita, the disruption of World War II, and then economic growth again through to the late 1980s. But as I pointed out before, really plateauing sort of in the 1970s and 1980s, and the growth rate being a bit slower in this period after World War II than the period in the 1930s. In China, we've got, in the lead up to the economic reforms, again, we've got some economic growth. It certainly pushes China above the position that it was in the period before the Communist Party had come to government. So you would have to characterize the period of communist government in the Soviet Union and China as being associated with some limited increases in GDP per capita associated with the success of the command-based economy in shifting economic activity increasingly away from agriculture and towards industry. That is the strategy of big push industrialization. And so I've got on this slide a couple of quotes from two different studies which basically make this point, that the communist command economy was relatively successful at forcing industrialization for a period and thereby achieving higher levels of GDP per capita than had been the case historically. So this is a quote from Richard Erickson: "The traditional Soviet system is very good at mobilizing scarce resources and concentrating on a few clear, well-defined objectives. The system has been particularly effective when the central priorities involve catching up." So basically saying a command economy can be an okay method of organising economic activity. There may be, as we know, and as we'll go on to talk about in the next couple of lectures, other difficulties, economic and political, with this type of system, but it can have limited success in directing an economy towards industrialization. Similarly for China, a quote from Brandt, Ma and Rorsky: "Under socialist planning, growth concentrated along the extensive margin sustained by a rising share of GDP channeled into investment." So the extensive margin basically means you're accumulating capital. You're growing because you are investing more in capital. You're able to do that because you're channeling a lot of GDP into investment. Now, as a final note on this early experience of the Soviet Union and China, it's also important to say that the Soviet Union's success under a communist government in industrializing in the 1930s becomes highly relevant to the outcome of World War II. So the Soviet Union, of course, would play a major role in World War II, and it's interesting to ask the counterfactual of what would have happened had the Soviet Union not had the industrial growth that it had in the 1930s. Of course, you could argue that, well, if it hadn't had a communist government, then they might have had a market system, and maybe the growth would have been even greater, so they would have been in an even stronger position as an industrial power in that war. We can't know. It is worth making the point, though, that it seems likely that there's a lot of difference in what would have happened in World War II between thinking of the Soviet Union as a country that had industrialized to the degree that it had in the 1930s versus not having industrialized any further. It's also worth making the point that the Soviet Union's success in industrializing, of course, means that in the 1950s and 1960s, it becomes a military superpower. That, in the Western world, is interpreted as meaning that the Soviet Union must also be a major success economically. Of course, what we recognize now is that the Soviet Union was a military power not because it had an economy as a whole that was as successful as Western economies, but because it was directing so much of its economic resources towards industrialization and towards military activity. So it was compensating for what it lacked in efficiency by pushing more resources towards military activity. Of course, that was at the cost of, for example, a much smaller proportion of GDP being allocated to consumer goods and services. Another point on these systems, which is the final point I'll make, is that as well as achieving success in industrialization and GDP per capita, the systems also did achieve major improvements in literacy, school attendance, maternal and infant survival rates, public health and life expectancy. That was the case both in the Soviet Union and in China, in particular in the periods in the 50s and 1960s. While these economies achieved these successes, of course, these successes were often disrupted by and interrupted by war and internal political instability, and they were offset by very significant political repression in both countries throughout the periods of communist government. That's not something I'll say a lot about in this lecture. I'm focusing on economic activity, but obviously when we think about the broad historical perspective, it's important to balance political conditions against what's happening in the economy. In the next section of the lecture, I'm going to move on to talk about what I think is a major shortcoming of command-based economies, especially in circumstances where those economies are poor economies. That is the idea that command-based economies are more vulnerable to food shortages and famine.